everybody. Welcome to the second day of Afems. It's been really lovely over the last day to watch people meet new people and make friends. And for those of you for whom this is your first Afems, I'm entirely sure it will not be your last. So my name is Conita Mohammed. I'll be chairing this session. It is my great privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Pumla Gqola. She's the research professor at the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University, and she's also the Saatchi NRF chair in African Feminist Imagination. Yes. And if you don't know her, and you are not indebted to her work, you will be, because we all are indebted to the work that she's done to allow us to think about the long, long histories of violence, how it comes to rest in Black women's lives, how it reshapes our lives, and what it entails for us in our everyday living. But she's also offered us practices of freedom through the capacity to speak, to think, and to reckon with our conditions contemporaneously and also historically. Her work on enslavement, which was much, much earlier than the now nascent movement in thinking around enslavement in South Africa and what it has entailed, has been critical for those of us who think about the long continuities of violence and the erasure of our histories in the public imagination when we think about how oppression has come to constitute a society. So in my own work, for example, What is Slavery to Me, her book, What is Slavery to Me, Post-Colonial Slave Memory in Post-Apartheid South Africa, was invaluable towards thinking about how the world in which we produce knowledge erases the incredible violence that came to make South Africa as a state. And very frequently for many of us, our imagination of history rests in the short period of apartheid, when our history of settler colonialism is much more extensive, and our entire history was produced through plantation logics, and Pumla is one of the first people to recognize that and to offer us something to work with. Her work around rape, a South African nightmare, and how our relationships of gender and what it means for us to be men and women in the everyday, people in the everyday who are sexed, gendered, is constituted through violence, and the shaping of violence and the fear of violence has been integral for all of us to understand not just as an academic problem, but as something we live with every day. And what I've most appreciated about Pumla's work is her capacity to take really complicated and erudite and learned relationships to the archive, which those of us who are scholars have the privilege to have been inducted into, that we can read these really dense, awful texts and then translate them so that any person who is interested in gendered violence and violence is able to read and understand what is happening around that. And that work of translation it's a lot of work to be able to write so that everybody can understand you. And likewise, her most recent book, The Female Fear Factory, is something that has reshaped how we think about the distribution and the effect of politics around fear and what gender does to how the gendering of our worlds and its locatedness within racial capitalist, a binary imagination produces a way of moving through the world that is oppressive and terrible and difficult, and at the same time, in showing us what our world is constituted by, she also offers us the possibility for thinking and feeling our way out of it through offering us wonderful feminist models and feminist theories through which to reimagine our world. So it is with great pleasure that we ask Pumla to.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Carnita. That was so incredibly generous. I was going to start by fighting with Charlene, but now I feel like, after that, I have to do something more elevated. So, Charlene, how much did you pay the wonderful Khadija?
Let's talk about it later.
I'm delighted to be back at Afems. And I too am grateful, and I'm also grateful for all the work that has gone into conceiving of this space and kept it going for as many years as we have had it. That's you, Linda Spencer. Where is she? And Charlene Khan. Thank you also to all the members of this year's organizing team. I know that events like this do not make themselves happen. That you all, no doubt, had many headaches, and that the more successfully seamless anything appears, the harder the work behind the scenes that has gone into making it so. So thank you. The loss of bell hooks, Amaata Aidu, Mishera Mugo, is deeply felt. Much more is the appreciation for their life's work, from which we continue to learn and draw. In our sister Killjoy, or Reflections from a Black-Eyed Squint, Amaata Aidu presents us with an African woman subject who energetically takes up his stance as interpreter of worlds and world maker. Aidu draws attention to Sisi's interpretative authority and willfulness and characterization, as well as the specific manner in which she maps. Sisi's willful, undisciplinable psyche, textually in a text that has been variously labeled a novel, a novella, a traveler's tale, unusually eclectic, and an inversion of the colonial travel narrative, and a text that stages situated, according to Cheryl Sterling, situated theoretical transformation, engaging with issues of racial subjectivity, sexuality, and political positionality. Here, Aidu situates a performative self in the text through an interrogatory narrative voice that succeeds in both deforming the novelistic pattern and participating in the critique of Western subjectivity and hegemonic feminist positioning, while inserting a resistant feminist ideology into a Pan-Africanist discourse to re-envision the role of African women in Africa's development. That's according to Cheryl Sterling. I think that Aidu's text does infinitely more than simply address a Western audience. I think there was a complication. Our sister Killjoy also complicates our understandings of what I will speak about as Europatriarchy as well as Afropatriarchy, which are more than the kind of intersecting systems, but the logics that have a long reach that come from those spaces, but more on that in a minute. In other words, Aidu's Our Sister Killjoy is an early staging of what I've come to call creative theorization, alongside Charlene Khan, who always insists that we didn't develop this together, even though we didn't know each other. I mean, it's remarkable to me that we come to this idea of what creative theorization in the 2007-2008 moment of both our publications on this up here. But Charlene always generously and inaccurately says, Pumla's concept, which I then use later on. So we're at Afems, so I can tell the truth, Charlene. Instead of sitting there going, Importantly, in Aidu's text, whereas the literary scholarship differs significantly on what is most important about Aidu's focalizer and protagonist, Sissy, there is shared recognition of the textual slipperiness when it comes to genre. Sissy's skepticism in the face of explanations, for example, Sissy's skepticism in the face of explanations for Africans choosing to remain in Europe receives much attention as commentary on colonial inheritance, post-independent disillusionment, as well as specifically anti-patriarchal critique. Less attention is given to her equally cynical approach to love and friendship with the important Bavarian woman figure that she temporarily befriends and romantically flirts with for one brief scene. Aidu writes Sissy as a character that stands apart, not in loneliness, but partly because what is on offer for Sissy is so often experienced as underwhelming. For example, the West African men students and professionals she questions in London choose unconvincing explanation, desiring as they do her empathy. For Sissy, who finds self-victimization tiresome, the novel suggests that more interesting, which is to say less predictable, explanations or confident assertions of the decision to stay as choice would elicit more respect from her. Aidu offers us more than a focalizer or narrator, and it's insisting on a black woman with what Carol Boyce Davis might call a migratory subjectivity, mapping of expansive planetary imagination and plotted onto a timeline that refuses neatness. The Killjoy character, Sissy, looks backwards and forwards and sideways with a questioning gaze that deconstructs a litany of systems of valuation, European and African, old and new. A word about my framing concepts, creative theorization. Creative theorization comes from African feminist engagements with creative registers and the work of African feminists. Although the naming of creative theorization is mine and Charlene Khan's, it is one I come to not solely from my own study of literary, visual, and film texts, but also from voracious reading and engagements with the interpretative lenses of other scholars, other African feminist scholars of creative genres. I explain it here not only for clarity, but because I have a bit of an agenda. Creative theorization describes what creative texts produce that enables us to think about the world, its structures and their realms of possibility within the worlds of the text themselves, but also the material world beyond. This is more than the taken for granted knowledge that all creative texts have the capacity to produce insights. Creative theorization is a capacity that is possible in all creative texts, but it is not one that is evidenced and staged and executed in everything. Creative theorization produces not so much, or is important not so much because it charts a counter. Sorry, I lost something. Here. It does not count. It is not important. It's important not so much because it charts a counter narrative to the exclusively and hyper-embodied African, which is what I'll be talking about today, on which it rests, but rather because it significantly alters the terms of the debate altogether. In many ways, and creative theorization is an associated concept to the way in which Dinali Gaga spoke about refusal yesterday. it disrupts, it is not simply in the line, as I say, it alters the terms of definition and debate altogether. And I hope to show in the text that I will use today, that I'll refer to today, in the creative text that I'll refer to today, the way in which this is done. Creative spaces offer an ability to theorize and imagine spaces of freedoms in ways unavailable to genres more preoccupied with linearity and exactness, as I've argued in 2008. Also in 2008, for Charlene Khan, creative theorization, I'm sorry, I'm being very petty, but you know, she did a whole presentation at another conference we were at, where she said, actually, let me trace the genealogy. And now, fortunately, she's an organizer and doesn't get to speak, so I get to be equally petty, because I was organizing that conference. So playful and petty. For Charlene Khan, creative theorization is elusive to more than what I referred to here, as genres more preoccupied with linearity and exactness, but also includes creative forms burdened with factual representation in the depiction or their depiction or illustrative value. Khan writes, scientific facts, she's writing about murals in this particular piece, of HIV, AIDS murals, and their inability to escape hegemonic Euro-patriarchal and Afro-patriarchal logics, try as they might. And so this is, of course, then not the site of creative theorization, because this is a continuation of hegemonic, violent hierarchies. So she writes, scientific facts do not always transfer easily into visual representation. By this I mean, I'm still quoting Khan, in visual representation, even a simple line drawing of a person can become loaded with racial, gender, and political overtones that are conveyed by how, what, and how much detail goes into the drawing. End of Khan. By creative theorization, we intend the series and forms of conjecture, speculative possibilities opened up in literary and other creative genres. Now, Khan is an art historian. I'm trained in literary scholarship. Today I want to talk about creative theorization in the work of three African feminist texts, or contemporary South African feminist texts, contemporary post-apartheid, contemporary, I'm 50, so I'm realizing, I say contemporary, I mean 30 years. This is not contemporary for some of the younger people in no, post-apartheid, but I'll talk about what I mean by that interrupt established notions of the hyper-corporalization of the black body. Long-standing Slavocratic and colonial renderings of black people and black women specifically have done so with excessive focus on their bodies in ways that write them into hegemonic epistemes as embodied, object, pathologized, deviant, evidence, knowable, or singular, freak, myth. Makhanda Gqola demonstrates that in the 18th and 19th centuries, black embodiment was represented as the meeting of two contrary impulses, as a suffering, and this is from her study of constructions of race and gender in colonial South Africa and Britain. Makhanda Gqola demonstrates that in the 18th and 19th centuries, black embodiment was represented as the meeting of two contrary impulses, of a suffering that could not be denied, but nonetheless had an incredibly fungible character. Now, what Makhanda Gqola traces in colonial South Africa and Britain continues long, has a long shadow, casts a long shadow well into kind of post-apartheid South Africa. The availability of the black body for such symbolic use as is pointed to by Makhanda Gqola is continued, unironically, in the work of the TRC, arguably the most important. So the body appears. So I don't want to talk about the TRC per se, but it's interesting that that this vehicle that is about processing and transforming, nonetheless, in its rendering and its languaging of black subjectivity relies on this longer history of black bodies as doing certain kinds of conceptual work. I'll spend a little bit of time on this because this is the creative theorization intervention I want to zoom in specifically in the work I'll talk about in a bit quickly. So the availability of the black body for such symbolic use then was not inaugurated by the TRC, but the TRC, like apartheid South African logic, like colonial logic that Makubane and in different places, Yvette Abraham's trace, relied on existing available tropes from the colonial and apartheid archive, from the colonial and apartheid era, from the colonial and apartheid conceptual libraries, to borrow a term from East African, from Den Ojwang's study of the enduring logics of colonial inscription well into the post-independent moment. It relied on available tropes from the colonial and apartheid era, from these conceptual libraries, which positioned black bodies as disciplinable, useful, and disposable. Indeed, the materiality of the South African body, the space of embodiment it occupies, and its ongoing mutilation, or once occupied under the disciplinary apparatus of the apartheid state, prison cell, torture chamber, farm, mass grave, domestic worker uniform, constituted one of the Commission's central preoccupations. The black body matters when we think about apartheid in ways obvious and hidden. All of these meanings reach into the afterlives of that formal political system. The elevation of the body in the making of the narrative, or the continuing elevation of the body in the making of the narrative that is supposed to interrupt and undo apartheid, is paradoxically in line with the elevation of the physical embodied in apartheid logic and the registers of its contestations in what is often called the protest tradition, but that's a fight for another day. Mm-hmm. And the protest tradition in Ndebele has been problematizing since the late 1980s. Importantly for my work here, primacy and taken for granted status of the body in official memory making stabilizes not just dramatic effect, but also a scopic one, a symbolic anchoring of South Africanness, of legitimacy, through a particular visual legitimation and logic that references apartheid logic as taken for granted. Black bodies as visible, white bodies as implied. Apartheid used white and black bodies in very different ways, not just in the definition of space and safety through what was deemed legible from bodies. Periodically, for example, on the TV news of my childhood in the late 70s and 80s, coverage of terrorist activity was represented by bloodied, empty rooms, standing symbolically for the homes of slain white people. The bodies themselves were never present. The blood and bullet-riddled walls and sometimes stained floors and or furniture were a strong scripting of terrorists' illegitimate prior presence and justification narrative for further violence against black activists. The white bodies themselves were never in the frame. The TRC did not disrupt this narrative in its retelling of violence enacted on bodies. For example, black people were perpetually presented as embodied, either in the crying feminine bodies narrating violence enacted on bodies of loved ones, as the yearned for black body, the missing body of a beloved activist, or the body whose torture, burning, or mutilation was under narration. So pervasive was this trope that novelist and cultural theorist Zoe Wickham, whose work I'll return to in a minute, slammed its presence in the TRC reportage, celebrated in the left, as the use of black women's bodies to signal texts which were about nationalist processes and anxieties, as also one of the projects of the rehabilitation of whiteness. This hypervisibility of black bodies and the specific rendering of the black female body in pain for discursive work critiqued by Wickham echoes what Teresa de Laurentiis had marked on Thus Woman, the paradox of a being that is at once captive and absent in discourse, constantly spoken of, but itself inaudible and inexpressible, displayed as spectacle and still unrepresented or unrepresentable, invisible yet constituted as the object and guarantee of vision. A vision whose existence and specificity are simultaneously asserted and denied, negated and controlled. The TRC had a long focus on the body as crucial, as evidence, as recoverable, as lost, as haunting when not found, and as symbolic of the South African wound, whose reiteration in and as discourse stood in for the wounding of the body and the body politic. In all of these cases, this was the black body. Even in cases where white death was discussed, such as very controversial, particularly controversial cases, such as the bombings by MK or Pumla guerrillas, or even in highly emotive cases such as MK guerrilla Robert McBride's bombing of the Maguba, which circulated constantly under apartheid and circulated constantly under post-apartheid as well. The state of buildings as visual, oral imagery were evoked to stand in for white death and devastation. McBride's own black male body, defiantly unwounded and messy, was then recirculated long after the TRC with failed but relentless disciplinary representation as monstrous. Indeed, in the black imagination, McBride's body, though not unproblematic, is besides the point. The mythology around McBride in the black imagination is all about willpower, ingenuity, adventure, camaraderie, loyalty. We have endless stories about how he, even wounded, he escapes from a hospital and then sneaks back in to help the rest of, there's so many myths about how he's an adventure. I mean, he's a super MK figure, but he's also this adventurer, loyal person who sneaks back into prison and hospitals to sneak his comrades back out. And so this sense of the absolute contrast between McBride in the black imagination and this kind of constant scripting of him as problematic, violent body, hyper violent man is quite important. Okay, I'm finishing with this. Importantly then, and unwittingly, as with apartheid before, black humanity and experience, even when explicitly emotional pain and trauma were under discussion, such as the material that Wickham analyzes, were codified and representable only through what was embodied for black people. White people entered this narrative through the language of interiority, through shock, avoidance, white guilt. An additional challenge to this visual and corporealist framing were the ways in which first gender, then specifically women and girls, entered the terrain of what was possible to address at the TRC. Now we will all, from the very onset, it was very clear. How am I doing for time?
10 minutes. If you want questions, 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to skip, the stuff. I think I've made I'm going to talk about. I think I've made my point about the body. I was just going to really drive it home. So dealing with this history requires a chaotic imagination rather than a disciplined one. Creative theorization is also keenly interdisciplinary and often informed by other literary and creative genres. In spectacular rendering, bodies have been made to function less as flesh and blood entities than as fertile discursive sites to be mined for images and metaphors. Undoubtedly, okay. Whereas the legitimated processes of apartheid memory, because of the legitimated processes of apartheid memory, we continue to think of apartheid in terms of embodiment, the text that I now turn to interrupt this narrative. I speak about, in their response to the casting of black people and black women as excessively corporeal. I speak of post-apartheid feminist imagination as an attempt to trace the long imaginative project undertaken by feminist writers and artists over the last 3 decades. It is post-apartheid both in the sense that it comes after apartheid and, even more importantly, as a feminist imagination that confronts apartheid logic by taking it apart and rendering it illegitimate. In other words, here I use post-apartheid both as a temporal marker, see like post-independence, and as a critique of, see post-colonial, post-structuralist. In comparative South African English studies, the literature after 1994 has been variously categorized under the labels post-transition, interregnum, post-millennial. I use feminist imagination to think about feminist expression in creative, cultural, suggestive modes, as well as explicitly activist political sphere, to trace the effects of the African feminist interrogative technique put to use in a range of texts and registers that exceed notions of mere response, resistance, movement, or even waves, to trouble the division between the sites of abstraction and sites of raw material, to pay attention to how creative cultural texts, sites, and performances produce transformative conceptual vocabulary. To answer, what does it mean to think about rioting women as writing women as rioting women, and rioting not as separate categories, but as intertwined and mutually embracing, as Susan Andrade does? To answer, what does it mean to actually think about the mute always speak, as Tabi Singh Mutsime reminds us? To take seriously and dwell on what the shouting silent that Xoliswa Sithole enables conceptually for feminist praxis and theory in her film of the same name. To be attentive to the emergence of what Khabiba Baleroon calls ambiguous visibility as violent, whilst trying to work with shifting forms of signification that return subversive intent or effect. To trace the contours of the conceptual libraries that emerge in the long shadow of apartheid, committed to undoing its logics. And I'm going to skip this part. I want to now turn to my examples, 3 examples very quickly. I'll spend more time on the second one. In David's story, an early novel in the tradition of which I speak today, Zoe Wickham crafts a novel in which the reader and protagonist, David, may not forget Sarah Baartman, Grotoa, or Dulcie. I always call it Dulcie, I don't know why. 3 iconic black women from different eras in South Africa's colonial and apartheid history. Baartman and Grotoa had lives that straddled freedom and slavery, are much mythologized. Grotoa is a transient figure in historical record, except in the work of Abrahams and Van der Spey, sometimes Van Riebeck's translator, sometimes Afrikaner stammoeder, never enslaved, seldom enslaved woman. Baartman's history is as a woman as a trafficked Khoi woman in body and in the world, in the academic world of ideas, as we see in Magubane's work on the what she calls a curious theoretical odyssey of Baartman in the construction of post-structuralist arguments around how we are to think about race. Whereas Dulcie, September, is a prominent anti-apartheid figure whose assassination in Paris has yielded more mystery than answer. Each is a mysterious figure beyond the text, whose life is used to symbolically construct, Each is a mysterious figure in the world beyond the text, whose life is used symbolically to construct a narrative that sublimates her biography in a larger constructed narrative about sexuality, power, collusion, that enables the settling of one of a series of narratives about nation and nationalism. Makubane has called attention to Baartman's curious theoretical odyssey in post-structuralist theory and theoretical illuminations of race. Here she is rendered singular and spectacular. Grotoa, like Dulcie, is important translator, but she disappears for large parts of her life, and we simply told often that her children are absorbed into Afrikaner society in the Stellenbosch area. Dulcie remains a trace in the archive, but one whose name is remembered at the expense of any real record of her extensive work. In different ways, then, these three black women remain traces put to the service of larger tropes. Enter Wickham's David story, where these women remain elusive, but as figures without whom David cannot write his story. Wickham's women who trouble the very meaning, women characters, are those who trouble the very meaning of what history is, as well as what it means to historicize and represent iconic black women rendered textually iconic in narratives that do not serve them, but work to obscure the granularity of their lives. Choosing to resist representing them for a proliferation of other women named like them points to the disposability of women's lives in all nationalisms. Batraman is called to mind everywhere in Wickham's text, not as body or hypersexual, but in a slew of characters who bear names such as hers. These minor characters who proliferate in Wickham's novel seem initially subservient, but prove to be riotous and revolutionary in a range of ways. They appear under various versions of her name, or versions of a name that approximates hers: Sarki, Sarah, Sally. All are part of how Wickham normalizes Sarah Baartman, important given that she was written as myth freak. In Wickham's hands, she remains important but not representable or fixable. Importantly, while Baartman and Dulcie both die mysterious but reportedly horrible deaths in Paris several centuries apart, Wickham's is neither a project of recovery nor one of recuperation. Instead, David's story insists that we continue to wonder about the individual characteristics unrecoverable from history and the ways in which their treatment tells us something about the usefulness of iconicity in its construction of white supremacist capitalist patriarchies, as well as in what Mina Salami has dubbed Europatriarchy, pointing not only to the material structure, but to the deeply embedded logics that stretch well beyond Europe and reach into crevices of thought systems ostensibly hostile to them. Next, I don't know how to do the thing. I wasn't given, like this? Oh. Sorry, I didn't see the map. Next, don't read, listen to me first. Next, and because I have to also apologize for my appalling translation. It will become more elegant. I'm a terrible translator, but anyway. Next, I turn to one of the most evocative preoccupations of Mthunzikazi Mbungwana's second collection of poetry, Unamwena, a collection with wide-ranging treatments of love, intimacy, violence, and joy, comes to us in 4 subdivisions of 11, 9, 16, and 1 poem. It is named for a love poem in which the language of play, sensuality, and Audre Lorde's conception of Eros as source of power interlace. Yesterday, Mbungwana read Unonga Indoda, and I have this poem too in mind, as well as her opening poem, which is up, but will focus my analysis on the rhetorical strategies in the latter, the poem up, and invitations to confront the colonial and apartheid library on black women, sexuality, and embodiment in a different poem. In Unamwena, the collection, Mbungwana stages situated creative theorization in thematically complex and stylistically nuanced directions on the body, relationality, survival, and affective landscapes. And despite her protestations that her preference is for sad poems, this text is also a wonderful cartography of feminist joy and feminist fury, and sometimes intertwining, at other times foundational, but never stabilizing tropes. So because I'm limited in time, when I speak of creative theorization in Afems Gqola, think also of Unonga Indoda. In a much longer piece on Mbungwana's creative theorization, I painstakingly trace the singularity of her vision and the work of what I call her stubborn feminist imagination, one that opens us as her readers up for resignification of what it means to take seriously affective and experiential landscapes of those whom patriarchy to render docile and useful. really pay attention, whereas I want to limit my analysis to these two poems, arguably, what Mbungwana theorizes in this particular poems is one of the signatures of the entire collection. If we really pay attention, we can see its genealogies in work that predates it. The title in Unamwena is the introduction to what Dinali Gaga yesterday helped us think of as refusal, the expression of African feminist agentic energy that inserts what Shilpa Patke names the feminist right to take risk. In both poems, Mbungwana's personae confront the challenges of being made female. So not woman, being made female. Unfortunately, I don't have time to restate what I mean by that, but I spend quite a lot of time in my book, Female Fear Factory, talking about the fact that female does not mean woman. It's the way in which, it's the product, it's the first product of the Female Fear Factory. First you have to be made female in order to then have fear structured primarily to police you. And those rendered female are all women, but also sometimes some gay men, people who trouble the boundaries of kind of patriarchal policing and who problematize and invert and sidestep the lie of the two binary genders. So, Mbungwana. I'm going to skip the last example, don't worry. The important, my chair is important, but I really want to spend some time on Mbungwana because I get so excited about this particular poem, but also some of the other. Importantly, Mbungwana's project, Unamwena, is about more than rewriting and unleashing but for the purposes of my argument today, I want to limit myself to these two poems. So I'm going to read the poem, and then you can read the poem. It's up. Lo mzimba isipili sokuqala. Lo mzimba awunyengezeki. Uyagqezula, lithamsanqa lesiqalekiso, imbewu ebolileyo. Ecabeni waphuncuka kubaprofeti bewukhupha idimoni. Elwandle dawocutha kwizigantsonso ezibini zamadoda ziwuxuba notywala. Udadobawo uboleke imali ezalayo. Uza kuxhela ibhokhwe. Lo mzimba usixheshisha ngobumnyama. Ndiziqhelise ukuwushiya ekhaya xa ndiphumela ngaphandle elizweni. Soyika amangaba antliziyo zikrakra, amilomo imdaka evuza izinto. Ezandleni ndifumbathe isikhaxa senwele, umdlavuza wobulolo undidlakazile. Now, I've done my little translation, but I've also told you at the bottom what the things literally mean, because it's a very bad translation. Mbungwana's poem is named for self-reflection. Her speaker looks at their own body. The gender of the speaker is not given, so I will just use they for, and also to help me distinguish between the she, who is the poet, and the they, who is the speaker in this poem. But Mbungwana does not write necessarily the speaker as a they, as you see. Her speaker looks at their own body, and it is a body worth observing, one that has exceeded and escaped numerous attempts to name it and to make it female in the way of the Female Fear Factory. Mbungwana gives us no indication of the gender of her persona, but she does script a speaker who has repeatedly collided with attempts to render them female. Mbungwana's stubborn post-apartheid feminist imagination crafts a speaker who confronts attempts to render them docile through the willful assertion of interpretative authority. Isipili Sokuqala is the introductory poem to Unam Nawe. It is also possible to translate the poem as the first mirror, because there is a secondary mirror in a poem marking a different division in the collection. I am choosing the reading of primacy here because it better underscores the sense of prioritization, the internal conceptual ordering and interpretative order suggested by the poet. This poem is also the opening poem of the entire collection, and in its placing, naming, and content, Mbungwana underscores the many deliberate ways in which the body she writes about exceeds inscriptive violence. Her choice of how to express this body's boundless capacity for freedom is important. Awunyengezeki. It is uncontainable. But ukunyengeza is a particular way of containment. It allocates agency to a secondary figure to insert something unfitting for this secondary figure's convenience. It is not usually used to refer to a person and also carries associations of disposability. The body reflected in the poem cannot easily be put in place. Awunyangezeki. It is a wildly free one as declared by the speaker in the very first line of the poem. The invitation is to interrogate what it means to speak from a position of freedom, a deliberate self-framing and constitution in the long shadow of apartheid logic. Mbungwana prompts a reader to focalize on the borders of interpretation, the speaker versus all those who would render their body a problem. This is a feeling, freedom-loving body that remains uncontrollable and troubles the boundaries, which seek to render it the docile body of evidence on display, a la Batman or Krotowa, obscured and ambiguously visibilized Dalsy. Instead, Mbungwana's speaker highlights the functions of Euro-patriarchal borders as sites of regulation, control, and conflict, not only over movement, but also over a variety of modes of inclusion and exclusion, and shows that there is work to be done there, so long as we register the need to challenge sedimented interpretative habits, disciplinary bodies, and norms of cultural and aesthetic value. In Unonga Indoda, the opening poem to the third segment of the poem collection, Mbungwana ironicizes the explosive figure of Unonga Indoda. In each stanza, the hegemonic construction of the woman troubles these. The explicit statements of Nonga Indoda's out-of-placeness are repeated in that poem in the italicized assertion that opens each stanza, and the following lines appear to offer explanatory detail of the italicized openers. However, Mbungwana's textual visual rendition of these scripts is of words that dance on the page in unpredictable, ununiform form that both recalls his signature aversion to structural symmetry, and we see this aversion to structural symmetry across Mbungwana's. She doesn't like sections that are the same number. She doesn't like standardized kind of stanzas, so she plays around with asymmetry across her work. Poems in the collection as a whole, an aversion that itself theorizes something about how to proliferate freeing imaginative and representational repertoires for those whose embodiment takes them away from the position human in the colonial and apartheid archive. In Unonga Indoda, Mbungwana repeatedly disrupts the hegemonic italicized text and the support evidence through her irregular and excessive punctuation, which is remarkable because another one of Mbungwana's signature is very sparse punctuation. And so this poem that is heavily punctuated stands out quite significantly in the reading of her poetry generally, but repeatedly disrupts these hegemonic italicized text. I'm finishing, literally 2 minutes. Well, maybe not literally. Literally in the way that my son said literally, I mean not literally. In Unonga Indoda, in the way that Pulo does, means Mbungwana's ordinarily sparse punctuation is deviated from here with the kinds of punctuation that challenges authority, creating conceptual distance between what the speaker says in Unonga Indoda and what we are to believe. An exclamation mark after yinto, for example, illustrates the force of the assertion, but adds little additional information in the tautological information revealed after in the first stanza. If Unonga Indoda is not a person but a thing, as the speaker declares, the listing of the ways in which she is not a woman seems excessive. But it is not the text that is excessive. It is the buttressing narratives. In a series of literary distancing techniques, Mbungwana interrupts the authority of the speaking voice in the poem repeatedly. A voice that seeks to build an argument for the demonization, annihilation of Unonga Indoda. this figure that troubles the boundaries of the masculine and the feminine, who is not allowed to be feminine in visual readings, but also in societal positioning. Whereas the speaker presents evidence of the subhuman, non-human object status of unonga indoda, Mbungwana renders impossible a seamless reading of this narrative. Her punctuation undoes the stated by troubling the relationships between what is stated in words and the meaning, conceptual navigational guides strongly suggested by the speaker. Here, an excessive exclamation mark, a confusing colon, and so on, unsettle the authority of the speaker by rendering it strange rather than normal and natural. Here, Mbungwana's creative theorization takes the sting out of both Euro-patriarchal inscription and Afro-patriarchal force. I'm going to stop there. The third text was going to be Gabrielle Goliath's Faces of War, but I won't. I'll stop there because I have taken.
Thank you very much, Pumla. We'll take one quick round of questions. So we're pressed for time. So if you have a question, can we make it brief, please? Questions? Yvette, Polo. Okay.
I just wanted to know about the loan. Like, is there some, what is the loan for? There's some reference that we're supposed to understand the loan.
Oh, so she says, so in Xhosa, when you speak about, literally it means a loan that gives birth, right? And right? That yeah, it's a loan. Uzala is to give birth. But what it means,
Why is she slaughtering the goat?
She's slaughtering the goat to deal with the. So in the poem, we have the kind of this kind of stating of this body. So there's a competing interpretation of the body. So these constant attempts to render the problem, to render the body female, docile, manageable, policeable, and the viewer's own sense of the body. And so the problem is various things. The blessed curse, demonic, right, in the second, save for, it slips out of a possible violent, a menacing. And slaughtering a goat is, of course, a spiritual way of, in the language of the poem, in kind of Xhosa cosmology, goats are how you communicate with the ancestors. So this problem of this body, right, is so significant that all of these attempts to police it, but also it is this unsolvable problem. So it is basically the equivalent of the demon exercising prophets, but in Xhosa cosmology. So it's asking for ancestral intervention in solving the problem of this body, right? And so it's this again staging by Mbungwana of this. So this is the dominant. There's a dominant kind of Euro-patriarchal, but also Afro-patriarchal idea of what this body is supposed to look like, and it exceeds these. It exceeds this. And so you have then, but of course this is a body that is owned by the speaker, despite and because of all of these kind of wounding, narratives, attempts.
Thank you so much, Pumla. I'm very, very excited about Charlene and yourself and the work of creative theorization and what you've illustrated and the possibilities that you illustrate through the reading of this poem. And I think so much of it echoes some of the places where I've been in thinking about the chaotic imaginary, right? The undisciplined. But what it means as a space for not knowing. So maybe there are things we don't know that will always escape and will always be slippery. But I was interested in this idea that some texts have the potential for creative theorization, and there's a sort of staging, there seems to be a staging performance that can be topographical, that can be grammatical, whatever it is, that seems to be integral to it. So I was hoping that you could expand on and maybe think about the unknown and how that operates as well.
In the longer and in a previous version, in reading of the Wickham text, in fact, that's exactly what I argue that the Wickham text does, right? That it doesn't erase the three figures, Krotoa, Bartman, and Dulcie, but it refuses, I call it on not representing Sarah Bartman, right? It is Wickham's, so, and in that piece, in that piece, I try to show how, because Sarah Bartman is written so much in interesting and not interesting ways, well, Wickham clearly not very interesting ways, right? Including by some feminist, in some kind of feminist rendering, right? That problematizes the colonial archive, but is trapped in the same. For Wickham, she is called to mind, but Wickham's decision is also not to render her in ways that make her knowable. And of course, this is important for Bartman because Bartman's entire existence in colonial archive, but also up until that point, until like the late 80s, mid-90s, she appears constantly as, with the slur that I will, the Venus, right? She appears repeatedly. But every time she appears, she is as evidence of something, the body on display, the body of evidence, and the contested body, the body you fight over, the person the historic subject you fight over. And Wickham, of course, it's important, I think, for David's story that we not forget Bartman. But not forgetting Bartman does not require representing and fixing and making her knowable, but Bartman recurs, the possibility of Bartman recurs in that novel, both as a present, like it's an absent presence, really, right? So it is a question mark, but it's not a symbolic question mark. It's not a question mark in order to do work for other people or for other sectors, which is why I think for Wickham, there's so many characters who are Bartmanesque, right? But they do work that sometimes doesn't make sense, that is not useful except to themselves. They appear one thing, but they do something else. But what they do is always riotous in a variety of ways that are not always legible within the world of the novel, but that are always legible to the reader of Wickham's text. And I saw, yeah, I don't. There was a second part, but I forgot what it was.
Thank you so very, very much for taking us into the world of a variety of